We are now in the third cycle of speeches, and here Job makes his eighth. But instead of replying to Eliphaz, he ignores him completely, and instead says what he has evidently been thinking about. We have seen that Job's speeches are a mixture of what he is sure is the case, that he is innocent, what seems to be the case, that God is his adversary and is utterly hostile to him, and what he would like to be the case, that he could take God to court, or that God would hide him in Sheol until his anger had passed. Chapter 23 sees Job very much in that wishful mode of thinking, though it is based on his certain knowledge of his innocence. It is worth saying as well that Job's hopes are always dashed, as he lifts his eyes and hands up to heaven for a moment, only to lower them back down to see his scarred flesh, the ashes, and the cold, contemptuous stares of his so-called friends. Job begins by wishing that he could find God, that he could find his heavenly throne room. He is sure that if he could only get face to face with him, he could lay out his defense, which he has well prepared in his mind, and God would now listen, not as an invincible opponent in a trial, as in chapter 9, but as the judge, listening and assessing. In this scenario, Job knows he would be acquitted. As I said in an earlier video, Job is not looking for the healing of his body or restoration of his fortune. What is at stake is Job's integrity and righteousness. But it is more than this. Job feels the torment of not knowing why. Why has God done all this? And in God's silence, more than Job's catastrophe, Job feels as though he has lost the God he thought he knew. Yet I think also that moments like this in Job's speeches show that Job still believes in the God he knew, because he is so sure that if only they could meet, then Job could have his say, and God would explain why it has all happened. But again, the gloom returns as Job, having asserted his innocence in verses 10 to 12, being sure that he could withstand any inquisition, resigns himself to the fact that God does whatever he wants, and whatever he has planned for Job, he will carry out. Therefore, as he goes on, the dread of the Almighty overwhelms him, and now the idea of actually being in the presence of God is utterly terrifying. Job now turns in chapter 24 to a complaint about the way things are and what seems to be the case with God's side of it. He asks in verse 1, "Why are times not kept by the Almighty? And why do those who know him never see his days?" Perhaps Job is thinking of Deuteronomy 32:35, where the Lord says, "Vengeance is mine, and recompense, for the time when their foot shall slip, because the day of their calamity is at hand, their doom comes swiftly." But when is this day of calamity? Job is probably not thinking of the great day of the Lord, but of regularly appointed days of judgment where accounts are settled. Job does not expect an answer to his question why. He is uttering a lament. It is simply the case that people abuse each other horribly and constantly, and there is no judgment. He lists in verses 2 to 12 the various common ways this happens, which are mainly those who have more oppressing those who have less. In fact, it is such deeds which Eliphaz diagnoses as lying behind Job's condition in 22:5-9. It is deeply ironic, therefore, that the judgment which Job laments does not happen is exactly what his friends think is happening to Job. In verses 13 to 17, Job describes the existence of those who are even more committed to evil, who operate in darkness, in rebellion to the light. This is reminiscent of John 1:5, where Jesus is the light who shines in the darkness, but particularly 3:19 to 21, where John says people love the darkness because their deeds were evil. Here in Job, the deeds described break the 6th, 7th, and 8th commandments. With his typical poetic power, Job summarizes them in verse 17. For deep darkness is morning to all of them. They are friends with the terrors of deep darkness. The rest of the speech, from verses 18 to 24, is very difficult to translate and understand. It appears to be completely at odds with what Job is saying, and many scholars think this section originally belonged to one of his friends, as it represents their viewpoint. It is too complicated to get into here, but the final verse seems to be Job's words, which are a challenge to disprove the facts as he has stated them.